The story begins as a grim tally sheet, a list of discarded lives scattered like refuse along the sun-scorched asphalt seams of Florida's highways. One by one, they were found. 7 men, their final moments brutally erased, their bodies unceremoniously dumped in the dense, humid scrubland. The forensic signature left by the killer was chillingly and unnervingly consistent, a calling card written in lead. Each man had been killed by slugs from a .22 caliber pistol. As the body count methodically rose from 1 to 2, then 3, a palpable and spreading fear gripped the state. The highways, once symbols of freedom and carefree tourism, transformed into arteries of anxiety, haunted by a phantom predator whose methods were consistent but whose identity was a terrifying unknown. The press, sensing a story of sensational proportions, scrambled to assemble a narrative, to forge a label that could contain the escalating horror for a public desperate for answers. When an arrest was finally made, the headlines didn't just report the news, they detonated. The boogeyman that law enforcement and the public had collectively imagined, a ruthless male drifter most likely, was not who they had caught. It was a woman. The media frenzy was immediate, ferocious, and culturally electrifying. Journalists christened her America's first female serial killer, a moniker both factually debatable among criminologists and powerfully resonant with the public. They eagerly painted a portrait of a monstrous anomaly, a predatory creature in human form, giving her the lurid title, Damsel of Death. But we are not here tonight to simply rubberneck at the carnage, or to rehash the simplistic black and white talking points of tabloids from 3 decades ago. We are here to push past the easy labels and venture into the profoundly uncomfortable grey territory that the headlines so conveniently skipper. So, we are asking the essential question that lingers long after the news cycle has moved on, the question that gets to the heart of this human tragedy. Was Aileen Wuornos born broken, a fundamental error in the human code, a monster from the start? Or was she systematically dismantled piece by piece, bone by bone, by the very world and the very people who were supposed to protect her, until the accumulated damage caused something deep inside to irrevocably snap? The answer, as you will see, is far from simple, and it forces us to confront deeply unsettling truths about the fragile lines we draw between victim and predator, madness and malice, and the catastrophic societal failures that can pave a road straight to hell. She entered the world on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, a leap-year baby named Aileen Carol Pittman, and from that first moment, it seemed she was already on probation from life itself. The concept of a stable, loving home was a fantasy she would never come close to knowing. Her father, Leo Pittman, was a diagnosed schizophrenic and a convicted child molester, whom she would never meet. His life was a ghost story, haunting her own before it even truly began. In 1969, he ended his own life using a prison bed sheet, a specter of violence and mental illness defining her origins. Her mother, Diane, just a teenager herself when Aileen was born, was overwhelmed and vanished when Aileen was only 4 months old, abandoning her and her older brother, Keith, to an uncertain fate. They were subsequently taken in by their maternal grandparents, Laurie and Britta Wuornos, but to say they were cared for would be a cruel and profound misrepresentation of their existence. The home was not a sanctuary, but a crucible of torment, steeped in alcoholism and rage. Laurie Wuornos, her grandfather, was a man of violent temper who subjected Aileen to a relentless campaign of horrific physical and sexual abuse, often forcing her to strip naked before beating her mercilessly with a belt. The psychological cruelty was just as sharp and calculated to break her spirit. In one instance of pure sadism, Laurie forced her to watch as he drowned a helpless kitten, a lesson in brutality and the disposability of the weak. Even the very foundation of her identity was built upon a lie. She and her brother were raised to believe their grandparents were their actual parents, a fundamental deception that shattered when she was around 11 years old. By that time, survival had already become a brutal, soul-crushing transaction. She was trading sex for cigarettes, drugs, and scraps of food at the locus, roller rink, earning the cruel and dehumanizing nickname Cigarette Pig. At 13, after allegedly being raped by a friend of her grandfather, she became pregnant. Shamed and discarded, she was sent away to a home for unwed mothers. After giving birth to a boy who was immediately put up for adoption, she was kicked out of her grandfather's house for good, the moment the hospital bracelet came off her wrist. At just 15, she was utterly alone and homeless, sleeping in woodsheds, abandoned cars, and selling her body for meager scraps of food. If you were to check every single box on an Adverse Childhood Experiences ACE quiz, a clinical tool that measures childhood trauma like abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, Aileen would have aced the test before she was even old enough to legally drive. The groundbreaking ACEs study directly links high scores to a future rife with mental health struggles, substance abuse, and interpersonal violence. The age-old question of nature versus nurture feels almost moot in her case. In Aileen's life, nurture never even bothered to show up. For a girl who had been forged in the frozen woods of Michigan and cast out into the cold, the dream of Florida sunshine was a deeply powerful and almost mythical lure. Hitchhiking her way south became her twisted, desperate version of an Ivy League education, a frantic flight toward what she prayed would be a new life, a new beginning, a complete reinvention of a self that had only ever known pain. But the warmth she so desperately sought proved to be entirely illusory. Instead of finding herself on sunny, postcard-perfect beaches, she landed in the gritty, diesel-fumed reality of truck stop parking lots and the transient, perilous world of a highway sex worker. This was never a choice made from a position of freedom or opportunity. It was the grim, inevitable continuation of the only survival skill she had ever been taught. The road became a brutal classroom in paranoia and self-preservation. The men who picked her up, her Johns, were a rotating, faceless cast of potential dangers. They were strangers who used her body and often her spirit with chilling indifference. Some paid her, some stiffed her, and many, far too many, paid her in bruises, violence, and degradation, reinforcing the lessons of her childhood that she was worthless and disposable. She learned to keep a beat-up .22 caliber revolver, a grim tool of a grim trade, stitched carefully into the lining of her purse. Amidst this perpetual chaos, a flicker of genuine light appeared in 1986. At a gay bar in Daytona, she met Tyria Moore, a shy, church-raised motel maid. For Aileen, who was 30 at the time, meeting the 24-year-old Ty was like finding a secure anchor in the middle of a Category 5 hurricane. Their connection was immediate and intensely emotional. They soon moved in together, renting a simple cinder-block studio that, for Aileen, represented a palace. For the very first time in her entire life, this air was a tangible semblance of normalcy. There were small domestic rituals, matching coffee mugs, shared household routines, and most importantly, someone to come home to at the end of the day. She would later try to capture the depth of her feelings for Tyria, stating, "Earthly words cannot describe how I felt." But even this fragile, newfound stability couldn't erase the fundamental, relentless problem. Survival costs money. Rent was always due, food had to be bought, and Aileen's only reliable source of income was the very one that continually exposed her to the risk of violence and profound degradation. The highway, with its dark promise of quick, dangerous cash, was always whispering her name, pulling her back into its orbit. By 1989, at the age of 33, she was already ancient by the brutal, unforgiving standards of street-level sex work. She would sometimes joke about being too old for this game, but beneath the dark, gallows humor was a desperate, gnawing awareness that her life was entirely unsustainable. The constant exposure to violence, the crushing financial desperation, and the immense psychological weight of her entire past were a volatile cocktail, simmering and ready to explode. Something, inevitably, had to give. The breaking point, the moment the simmering cocktail finally boiled over, arrived on November 30th, 1989. The man who would become the first victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics shop owner driving a Cadillac. He picked Aileen up along Interstate 75 for paid sex. What happened next depends entirely on who you believe, and this divergence in narrative would come to define her entire legal battle. According to Aileen's consistent and unwavering account, the encounter turned violent almost immediately. She claimed that once they were in a secluded, wooded area, Mallory became monstrously brutal, beating and raping her. She testified that he lunged for her throat, and in a terrifying primal struggle for her very life, she managed to reach for the .22 caliber revolver in her purse and emptied it into him. She then shoved his body into the dense Florida palmettos and fled in his car, a desperate escape from a scene of horror. Police would find Mallory's abandoned vehicle just 2 days later, but his body remained hidden for nearly 2 weeks before being discovered by chance at a junkyard. He had been shot multiple times in the chest. Aileen, meanwhile, had already begun the process of erasing him, pawning his camera and radar detector for cash, acts that would later become a crucial centerpiece of the prosecution's narrative against her. But there was a stunning, explosive piece of information, a critical detail that the jury who would later decide her ultimate fate was never, under any circumstances, allowed to hear. Richard Mallory was not just a respectable local businessman. He had a sealed criminal record from Maryland that included a conviction for a violent, attempted rape. This single fact could have dramatically and fundamentally altered the entire narrative of the trial, lending significant, powerful credence to Aileen's claim of self-defense. Could it have flipped the script entirely, recasting her not as a predator, but as a victim who fought back with lethal force? The state of Florida, however, effectively shrugged its shoulders. Prosecutors successfully argued that her actions after the killing, robbing him of his car and methodically pawning his possessions, demonstrated a clear and calculated motive that went far beyond mere self-preservation. For them, Mallory's past was irrelevant. It was Aileen's present actions that mattered. The evidence of the pawn shop slips established a damning pattern in their eyes. This was not a desperate, one-time act of defense, but the calculated and cold-blooded beginning of a robbery and murder spree. The file on Richard Mallory's violent past remained sealed, and the context that might have saved her was buried just as surely as his body had been. The death of Richard Mallory was not, as it turned out, an isolated event. It was the terrifying opening chapter of a bloody and chaotic 11-month period. Between the end of 1989 and the fall of 1990, 6 more men would fall, creating a pattern of violence that terrorized the communities of Central Florida. The rhythm of the crimes became eerily and chillingly similar. A man, almost always a middle-aged motorist, would pick Aileen up as she hitchhiked on the highway. An encounter would follow, often escalating into an argument and ending in a hail of gunfire. She would then take their car and whatever valuables she could quickly find, later selling them at various pawn shops for cash to support herself and Tyria. The victims came from all walks of life, a cross-section of ordinary men who fatefully crossed her path. David Spears, a 43-year-old construction worker, was found on June 1, 1990. He had been shot 6 times. Less than a week later, the body of Charles Carskadden, a 40-year-old part-time rodeo hand, was discovered. He had been shot 9 times, with the coroner noting with grim fascination that the bullets were grouped together in a tight, precise cluster, suggesting a cold, deliberate execution rather than a frantic struggle. Other victims included Troy Burris, a sausage salesman, Charles Dick Humphreys, a former police chief and, ironically, a child abuse investigator, and Walter Gino Antonio, a trucker and reserve police officer. As the bodies continued to mount, seasoned detectives were left baffled and chasing ghosts. Their working theory, based on all established criminal profiling norms of the era, was that they were hunting for a male drifter, someone physically strong, ruthless, and highly mobile. No one in law enforcement, and certainly no one in the general public, could conjure the image of the killer as a petite, 5'4" blonde woman holding a cardboard South sign on the shoulder of the highway. The very idea was unthinkable, a statistical and psychological impossibility. Meanwhile, As the statewide manhunt intensified, Aileen and Tyria Moore were living a bizarrely surreal, almost manic existence. They were blowing the stolen money from these men's last moments on cheap motels, endless cases of beer, and hedonistic all-you-can-eat shrimp buffets. In a particularly chilling detail, they would watch the local news reports about the string of unsolved murders, and Aileen would openly laugh at the anchors and police spokespersons, derisively calling them clueless for their wildly incorrect theories about the killer's identity and gender. The press, initially fascinated by the string of crimes, escalated their descriptions as the months wore on. The unknown killer was no longer just a suspect. They were becoming a media creation, a lurid character for the nightly news, eventually dubbed the Damsel of Death. The nickname stuck instantly, cementing the image of a cold-blooded femme fatale in the public imagination long before the full, desperate and tragic story ever came to light. The bloody spree included a seventh murder, though it would ultimately remain officially unconfirmed by a conviction. The victim was Peter Seames, a 65-year-old retired merchant seaman whose body was never found. Despite the absence of a body, police found his abandoned car, and inside they discovered the single most crucial piece of physical evidence in the entire investigation: Aileen's handprint. But the real break in the case didn't come from a crime scene or a forensic lab. It came from within the one relationship where Aileen had ever felt safe. Her partnership with Tyria Moore, the emotional anchor of her turbulent life, began to fracture and then shatter under the immense, unbearable strain of the secrets Aileen was carrying. During a drunken, explosive argument, Aileen confessed everything to Tyria, laying out the entire string of murders with a chilling and matter-of-fact clarity. That single fight changed everything. Terrified by the confession and what it implied about the woman she loved, Tyria fled Florida, returning to the safety of her family in Pennsylvania. It wasn't long before investigators, having already identified Aileen's fingerprint on a pawn shop receipt linked to one of the victims, managed to track Tyria down. They saw their opportunity and presented her with a terrible choice: help them elicit a confession from Aileen over the phone, and she would be granted full immunity from any prosecution. Faced with the possibility of being implicated in the murders herself, Tyria agreed. What followed were a series of devastating, police-guided phone calls that amounted to a profound betrayal. With detectives listening in and coaching her on what to say, Tyria pleaded with Aileen, telling her that the police were closing in on her and that she, Tyria, desperately needed Aileen to confess to clear her name. On January 16, 1991, worn down, emotionally, broken and desperate to protect the woman she still loved, Aileen confessed over the phone. Even in her confession, she maintained that the men had tried to rape her and that she had only killed them in self-defense. Just days earlier, on January the 9th, police had located and arrested Aileen without a fight at a gritty biker bar in Port Orange called The Last Resort. She was calmly drinking a beer when they walked in, arresting her on the simple pretext of an outstanding warrant. When she was finally confronted with the murder charges, her reaction was not one of defiance or denial, but of utter exhaustion. She simply asked for a cigarette and said, "I'll plead guilty. Just get me off the streets." A female serial killer, a criminal profile so exceptionally rare to begin with, surrendering peacefully in a bar without a chase or a struggle, is a phenomenon that criminologists to this day still describe as being as unlikely as finding a unicorn or a leprechaun. Her violent year-long spree had ended, not with a bang, but with the heartbroken and betrayed words of a woman giving up. The state of Florida made a strategic decision to prosecute Aileen for the murder of Richard Mallory first, viewing it as their strongest and most straightforward case. The trial began in January 1992 and almost immediately devolved from a legal proceeding into a full-blown media spectacle. The prosecution, led by a confident and determined team, built a powerful, clear-cut case that was centered on two simple motives: greed and calculated, predatory violence. They presented the jury with a mountain of physical evidence that inextricably linked Aileen to the crime, most damningly the pawn shop slips for Mallory's belongings, which bore her own fingerprints. In a crucial legal maneuver, they successfully utilized Florida's Williams Rule, which allowed them to introduce evidence from the other murders to establish what they argued was a clear and undeniable pattern of criminal behavior. This tactic was devastatingly effective, painting her not as a traumatized victim who fought back, but as a predatory robber who killed for money. What the jury didn't get to hear about, however, was Richard Mallory's sealed conviction for attempted rape, as the judge had ruled it inadmissible, deeming it irrelevant to the case at hand. Without this vital context, the defense's argument of self-defense crumbled into dust. It took the jury under 2 hours to return their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. During the sentencing phase of the trial, Aileen's carefully contained composure finally shattered, and her deep-seated rage and despair boiled over in front of the world. She screamed at the court, her voice raw with anguish. "I'm not a serial killer, I'm a serial defender. I was raped, I was raped, I was raped." Her furious outburst, captured by the ever-present court TV cameras, was broadcast to millions, becoming the defining image of her trial. It may have been a moment of raw, desperate truth for her, but it did nothing to sway the legal outcome. The jury unanimously recommended a sentence of death, and the judge readily agreed. Aileen would eventually stack up 5 more death sentences as she pleaded guilty or no contest to the other murders. In the aftermath, she spiraled into a defiant, self-destructive war against the very system she felt was railroading her, firing every lawyer who attempted to file an appeal on her behalf. It was during this bizarre period on death row that the story took one of its most surreal turns. A born-again Christian horseboarder named Arlene Pral saw Aileen's picture in the newspaper and claimed God had told her to reach out. An unusual correspondence began, which bizarrely culminated in Prale legally adopting the 35-year-old death row inmate via certified mail. Together from behind bars, they became a grim cottage industry, selling signed Polaroids and other macabre memorabilia for $10 a pop to true crime enthusiasts, a desperate and grotesquely surreal attempt to bankroll a last-ditch legal defense. The courtroom drama had officially and irrevocably become a circus. By 2001, after nearly a decade spent in the suffocating confines of death row, Aileen Wuornos' story underwent a dramatic and chilling transformation. The defiant, consistent claims of self-defense that had defined her trial and her early years of incarceration began to systematically vanish. They were replaced by a flat, cold, and remorseless confession, delivered with an unsettling lack of emotion. In a series of startling interviews, most notably with the filmmaker Nick Broomfield for his documentary Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer, she eagerly adopted a brand new narrative. "I killed those men," she stated, her voice devoid of any affect, "robbed them as cold as ice. And I'd do it again too. I have hate crawling through my system." Some criminologists and forensic psychologists refer to this disturbing phenomenon as narrative surrender. After years, sometimes decades, of fighting a legal system they feel is rigged against them, some inmates simply give up the fight. They stop trying to explain or justify their actions and instead embrace the monstrous mask that has been crafted for them by the media and prosecution. Owning the worst possible version of their own story becomes a final, perverse act of control, a way to speed up the inevitable exit and put an end to the torment of waiting. Aileen's surrender was absolute and unequivocal. She fired her lawyers for good, dropped all of her remaining appeals, and began writing impassioned letters to the Florida Supreme Court, demanding that her execution be carried out as swiftly as possible. "I'm one who seriously hates human life and would kill again," she insisted in her writings, arguing forcefully that she was sane and fully competent to make this monumental decision. A court-appointed panel of psychiatrists, after a brief evaluation, agreed with her assessment, and Governor Jeb Bush subsequently signed her death warrant. In her final days, she gave a series of bizarre interviews, claiming her mind was being tortured by sonic pressure from the prison guards, laughing maniacally one moment while seething with uncontrollable rage the next. On the morning of October 9, 2002, she declined a last meal, requesting only a single cup of coffee. Strapped to the gurney, Her final words were not of remorse or reflection, but a strange, rambling and cryptic prophecy. Yes, I would just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie. Big mothership and all, I'll be back. At 9:47 a.m., she was pronounced dead by lethal injection. Was it a promise of divine reincarnation, a final veiled threat, or simply the last disjointed, fractured thoughts of a mind that had long ago shattered into a million pieces? Like so much of her life, her final words left the world to simply place its bets and wonder. If this story is scrambling your neat little boxes of good and evil and forcing you to look at the darker, more complicated corners of human behavior, then hit that subscribe button. We believe every case is stickier and more complex than the headlines ever pretend. So now at the end of this harrowing journey, we stand at the ledger, attempting to balance an impossible and horrifying account. On the nature side of the column, the entries are surprisingly sparse. There is no definitive evidence of significant congenital brain trauma, no discovery of a so-called psychopathy gene that predetermined her violent path from birth. Psychiatrists who examined her pointed to diagnoses like borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. But these are complex conditions now widely understood to be shaped heavily, if not primarily, by one's environment and developmental experiences. They are often the scars left by trauma, not the cause of it. On the nurture side of the ledger, however, the ink overflows, bleeding across the page in a horrifying litany of developmental poison. The list is staggering and almost defies belief. Parental abandonment before she could even form conscious memories. A biological father who was a convicted predator and ended his own life in prison, and a childhood defined by an alcoholic and brutally abusive grandfather. This initial foundation of terror was followed by rape, a traumatic teenage pregnancy, the forced adoption of her only child, abject homelessness at 15, and then years upon years of survival sex work. A life where violence was not an aberration, but the relentless daily norm. It is an undeniable fact that Aileen Wuornos, and she alone, pulled the trigger. Her hands committed the acts that took 7 lives. But it feels equally undeniable that society, through its profound and repeated failures at every turn, spent 2 decades methodically loading the clip. Some of the victims' families, to this very day, see her as nothing less than pure, unadulterated evil, a monster who stole their loved ones without cause or remorse, and their position is unassailable and deserves the utmost respect. Some of the jurors from her trial have admitted in later interviews that whatever her tragic backstory, they sleep easier at night knowing she is gone. Yet her case file remains a cornerstone in criminology and psychology courses across the country, used to pose a deeply awkward and vital question. Where on this tragic timeline was the opportunity for intervention? One safe home, one attentive teacher who saw the bruises and didn't look away, one school counselor who could have offered a path beyond transactional survival, just one single adult who could have pulled the emergency brake on her terrifying descent into violence. Could a single point of positive, meaningful human contact have rewritten the bloody history that ultimately unfolded on Florida's highways? We can never know for certain. All we know for sure is that 7 men are dead, and the woman who killed them was once a wounded child that nobody at any point along the way seemed to want. Perhaps the ultimate takeaway from the harrowing life and violent death of Aileen Wuornos isn't about finding a convenient excuse for the bloodshed, because in truth, there is none. The 7 men she killed were fathers, sons, brothers, and friends. Their lives were not mere abstractions to be debated in a psychological thought experiment. They were real, their futures were stolen, and their violent deaths were an absolute and unforgivable tragedy. Instead, the enduring lesson may lie in the uncomfortable but necessary admission that the conveyor belt that produces human violence so often begins its slow, inexorable journey in the darkness of a traumatic childhood. Hurt people, and especially hurt children, often grow up to become hurting adults unless someone, somewhere along the line, has the courage, the resources, and the will to step in and yank the emergency brake. Aileen Wuornos never got that pause. She never had a single moment of genuine safety, protection, or meaningful intervention, and the catastrophic consequences of that failure screamed across every front page in the early 1990s, creating a media spectacle that was as fascinated with her monstrosity as it was ignorant of her history. So, we are left right where we began with the question that titles this exploration: monster or tortured soul? The answer you ultimately choose likely says more about your own personal framework for justice, mercy, and the complexities of human nature than it could ever definitively say about her. It is a reflection of where you, as an individual, draw the line between personal responsibility and societal failure, between evil and illness. And while you consider your own private verdict in this deeply troubling case, it is essential that we whisper the names of the men who never auditioned to become a part of anyone's traumatic origin story. The men who paid the ultimate price. They are the final, silent, and most important entries in this devastating ledger. Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Peter Seams, Troy Burris, Charles Dick Humphreys, and Walter Geno Antonio.